The problem we're trying to understand better is the fact that people with mental illness smoke cigarettes at incredibly high rates compared to the general population. So much so that people with mental illness, well over half of them smoke cigarettes, and they end up smoking over half of all cigarettes sold, even though they really represent only a small fraction of the total population. This is really a devastating problem for people with mental illness because of the broad health consequences of nicotine addiction. So the conventional wisdom for many, many years has been that people with mental illness smoke so much because they're essentially using nicotine and tobacco as a medication. The problem with this traditional thinking, one of the biggest problems with this traditional thinking is that it really doesn't do much to encourage clinicians or patients to treat nicotine addiction as a disease. The research I do is really focused on trying to understand how addiction and mental illness are related to each other. And one of the ways we investigate that question is by using animal models of mental illness and then testing those animal models in terms of addiction behaviors and in response to addictive drugs. We actually have a very good animal model, a rat model of schizophrenia that was developed about 20 years ago that reproduces many of the clinical symptoms and biology that we see in patients and human patients with schizophrenia. These rats showed us that the rats with the schizophrenia model much more avidly acquire nicotine self-administration both in the early and late stages and ended up using far more nicotine than healthy rats. This is exactly what we see in human populations with schizophrenia. Moreover, once we stopped those rats from having access to nicotine, they worked harder to try to get it back than the healthy rats. This suggests that across multiple phases of the addiction process, the abnormalities in the brain that give rise to schizophrenia also give rise to an enhanced vulnerability to nicotine addiction. So the question then becomes, well, might the nicotine still provide some kind of medication value to these rats? Well, as it turns out, these rats do have cognitive problems just like people with schizophrenia and other forms of mental illness. So we were able to test that question. The result of this, however, was that nicotine only had a marginal cognitive benefit to any of the rats. And more specifically, it had no more cognitive benefit to the schizophrenia rats than it did to the healthy rats. In sum, this research really does begin to call into question the thinking of our field in terms of why nicotine addiction happens so frequently in people with mental illness. It really does cause us to stop and think, you know, instead of as a field thinking of this as a self-medication phenomenon, shouldn't we really be thinking about it as an addiction phenomenon that is even worse in mentally ill people than it is in mentally healthy people, and certainly deserving of very aggressive addiction therapies?